Trump is confused almost as to why Iran has not surrendered and given way. He's not used to engaging in negotiations that are lengthy, that are complex. It suddenly appears that Israel has a different set of objectives and that it has been influential in pushing the US to war.
So thank you so much, Professor Darbishire, for joining us today on the Pakistan Global Alumni Network podcast. You've spent so many decades teaching at Oxford and in the field of negotiation. What did you notice about the recent talks that happened between Iran and the United States in Islamabad?
Well, I think that there are certainly some surprising elements of it, and in one sense, the most surprising element of it was how brief they were. One round of negotiations before J.D. Vance, as the Vice President of the U.S., departed with the rest of the U.S. team, is an incredibly short period of time to engage in what are extremely complex negotiations. I think that one of the dimensions that it's also very important to put this within the context of is that this negotiation in Islamabad does not, of course, stand alone, and we should never forget the context within which it stands is absolutely critical in understanding the nature of interactions, information exchange, and all of the other dimensions of negotiation. And so those would include, actually, if you want, really quite a long history. We can go back to the original negotiations that sort of took place from 2012 to 15 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Then we can, also include into that, if you really want, something like the decision by Donald Trump during his first term to withdraw the US from that in 2018, which then, of course, sets the context for more recent negotiations. But I think that of those, two other really critical contexts. One is the negotiations that took place last year up until June, when, of course, there were some quite detailed discussions going on. There was a long way still to go in those negotiations, but those were then, of course, interrupted for 8 months by the Israeli and American attacks on Iran. And then we moved to, I think, the more immediate and critical dimension of context in everybody's mind, which are the negotiations that took place under the auspices of Oman in February. And the I think the deeply surprising decision by the US to attack Iran in spite of the seeming progress of those negotiations. And so I think once you put these into that context, what you realize is that there are huge sort of challenges that arise from the path that we have come across to expect sort of some rapid negotiation or acquiescence of Iran to sort of demands of the US in one set of negotiations, even if they lasted 16 or 21 hours, depending on what reports you take. You couldn't really expect to reach a conclusion in that time. So I would expect many more rounds of negotiation if we are going to actually make sort of serious negotiation progress.
So many experts in the field of negotiation often define it as being about relationships and interests, not just positions. From that framework, if you were to analyze the way the US and Iran approached these negotiations, do you think they were actually trying to reach an agreement, or was this more them panning to their audiences back home?
I think there's another dimension to the negotiations which actually isn't what you've just touched on there, and really these negotiations were and the ability of Pakistan to persuade the US to be present within them was absolutely critical, because of the threats that Trump had made, to basically to wipe out a civilization. Right now, as soon as you do that, the criticality of finding an off ramp for Trump was absolutely essential. So what's the first most important thing that Pakistan did? It gave the US an off ramp where we could have a 2-week ceasefire, we could lower the temperature somewhat, and we could at least then have a set of talks. So that's, I think you could call it playing to an audience at home, but I think actually it's something much more fundamental than that for the safety of many people around the world. Not least in Iran and elsewhere. I think that the negotiations appear, from all accounts, to have been extremely positional and not, as you say, focused on sort of interests. Vance, when he left those negotiations, declared that Iran had not accepted the US position. But hopefully these, and that implies, as sort of Iran has declared, that it was our position, your position, and that there was very little movement. And that doesn't surprise me, given the context that we referred to earlier. So I think that, but current reports are that there will be some further rounds of negotiation, and we've really seriously got to hope that that will indeed be the case. I don't think you could expect much in that one-off scenario that we had the other day.
So in negotiation theory, there's a crucial distinction between what parties actually want versus what they say they want. So based on what's publicly available in terms of information, what do you think the US and Iran are actually wanting, apart from the nuclear enrichment and the Strait of Hormuz being open?
Well, I think that if you go back, if you like, to the previous rounds of negotiation, then you can see a much broader set of issues. So, there are maximalist demands that the US are putting, and of course, by I think all sort of the more detailed accounts from inside information on what's been suggested. There are suggestions of a role for the IAEA in terms of monitoring, in terms of suspension of enrichment for a time period. We can perhaps come back to that. But, Iran is a country in significant difficulties. We've seen that with the protests earlier this year and the, incredibly violent suppression of those. But I think what that illustrates and what underlines that is the state of the Iranian economy, which is, in an extremely bad state. And so the sanctions that have been in place for a long time, from the direct economic sanctions to the financial access to the financial system, etc., all of those are, important if Iran and the current regime in Iran is to try to stabilize the situation at home. It's one thing to be able to suppress sort of internal opposition. But that is not fundamentally a sort of the situation that I'm sure the current Iranian regime wants to be in. So I think that there are some serious economic issues that are at play as well. I think we've also got to recognize, I guess, that so we've got the immediate issues of the Strait of Hormuz and the decisions of about nuclear enrichment, but we've also got other actors in play. So you've got, for example, Israel, and Israel, I think, is much more sort of inherently aggressive in terms of wanting to continue to pursue the advantage that it perceives in terms of attacks, whether on Lebanon or indeed on Iran. And so I think that it is trying to use its influences to push the US in that direction. So we've got multiple sets of interest and goals that are present.
So when President Trump makes statements like "we win" in either situation, just from a cognitive framework perspective, how much of an impact does this have on how negotiations will play out after that? Does this influence the technical team that's doing the on-ground negotiations after this type of statement?
Um, well, of course, he hasn't said that we win. He said that he's actually, of course, declared that they've won whatever happens in these negotiations. So apparently, these negotiations, according to Trump, don't really matter. I think that anybody with any sophistication, and the Iranians have got a lot of experience on their negotiating team, and they're not naive about any of this. They will take any of these statements that Trump makes with a pinch of salt. You make a statement one day, it changes the next. So I think that in terms of and there's no consistency in the statements that are made. So let's just think about that with respect to sort of the nuclear enrichment or the nuclear capabilities of Iran. The US has declared that it has obliterated those. They don't have any to they are capable of producing a bomb in a week. To these things change, and I think once you become a little bit more sophisticated, you just take a step back from that, and you don't allow it to influence the path in which you then try to sort of follow. I think that the challenge, of course, becomes what the impact of Trump's cognitive sort of frame is on the negotiators. And of course, one of the oddities I think that we need to spend some time reflecting on are the particular choice of negotiators that have been present in the different stages of these negotiations, and what they perceive as their objective and what they perceive as their relationship with Trump and their acquiescence to sort of particular Trump statements. So if we've got Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner as the negotiators, who were center stage in the February negotiation, neither have the technical knowledge, the experience, or anything else to engage in these highly complex, highly sophisticated negotiations. And that means the regional expertise, it means the competence in the nuclear, it means the competence in the diplomatic versus business negotiations, which take very different paths. These are really challenging issues, and by all accounts, they fail to understand the importance of various dimensions within the earlier negotiations, and their ability to understand those in the ongoing negotiations, I think is a real difficulty if we're able to get to a position where we can move forward in a sort of serious way. So I think that Trump's statements and the way in which he perceives negotiations should be incredibly easy and to be able to be done incredibly quickly, and not require substantial patience and a long duration. I think that cognitive mindset really does impact the ability to reach an effective agreement. And let's not think that this is something that's new. You can go back to the early 1980s and the START negotiations, nuclear negotiations of the Soviet Union, where Trump declared he could do these in a couple of days. I mean, these things are not realistic. But if you're not prepared to engage in the deep and detailed sort of interactions and producing really sophisticated sort of agreements and working out, understanding the information from the other side, what it really means and what opportunities there are, which enable both sides to sort of, save face and so on, then you're going to find it incredibly difficult to reach an agreement.
If we touch upon the concept of loss aversion, where people fear losses more than they value strategic gains, how does this play out differently for both the United States and for Iran, where Iran, from their perspective, they see their very survival as one of the main things that's at stake in this war?
Yeah, absolutely. For Iran, this is, and for the Iranian regime, current Iranian regime, this is absolutely existential. And of course, one way of seeing what the objectives of the US was, and actually, there's an important sort of cognitive dimension behind the next point as well, which is that the US had perceived some real success in Venezuela, in removing Nicolas Maduro, and it appears that drawing in appropriate analogies, Trump thought that actually the same might be able to be easily done within the Iranian context, and remove the regime, have then a change of who is there. And that, I think, is a sort of a misunderstanding of how these things work. But you're absolutely right. This is existential for the Iranian regime, and that gives sort of limits to where they are going to go. But I don't think that, again, by I think that the more informed reports that came from the February negotiations, there were offers on the table which would allow Iran to both save face, but would have been incredibly meaningful in terms of the progress within the fundamental objectives of both sides. So, loss aversion can have, a material loss, but it's also about, saving face as well. And for both sides, that's going to be important. How can they sort of, declare victories in a way that goes beyond your the rhetorical statements you
So Vice President Vance walked into these negotiations with a very strong anchor, where he referred to it as our terms before the negotiations even began. What sort of psychological impact does this have before negotiations begin on the other party?
Well, I suppose we could differentiate between two different things. One is the psychological concept of anchoring, which is where if you put a large number on the table, or a proposal on the table, that anchors the other side, and means that as you start making sort of concessions, the end result will be closer to what your initial proposition was at the outset. And there's plenty of evidence from distributive negotiations where it's sort of one dimensional, that anchoring can have a significant impact because of its cognitive frame. Once the other parties become more sophisticated, then I think that gets diluted. But one of the challenges with anchoring is that it can impede the ability to share information. It can impede the ability to learn and to develop more creative solutions. Because if you just start with an anchor, you're starting with a more extreme proposition, and you're focused on that rather than the deeper, the more detailed sort of discussions that need to take place. In other words, what happens is that the negotiations shift to being what you referred to earlier as positional. They are no longer focused on the underlying sort of interests and creative ways of being able to construct an agreement that is going to be, sort of beneficial. So I think that, if you go in with a maximalist statement and that is effectively a positional statement, then you're in a really difficult position to reach an agreement unless the other side is willing to bow to your power and to sort of exceed and basically surrender. And the problem is, as you referred to earlier, that this is existential for the current Iranian regime, and so that's not going to happen. So you need to have a much more, again, sophisticated negotiation approach. There does appear to be a sense in which Trump is confused almost as to why Iran has not surrendered and given way, and that shows a very sort of different mindset that he's come from. He's not used to engaging in negotiations that are lengthy, that are complex, that are that require a lot of diplomatic skill. He hasn't effectively done this with respect to Congress within the US. He didn't do it sort of in the first regime, whether you're looking at Obamacare, whether you're looking at Iran. We haven't seen this type of more sort of complex negotiating approach where you're building a deep and sophisticated agreement. So I think that there is a difficulty that goes beyond just positional statements towards a model of negotiations that is necessary in order to be effective in this type of incidents, but others similar to it.
So, Professor, you're renowned for your work in both influence and persuasion. Pakistan successfully managed to convince two fighting nation states that had not met at the same table for the past 50 years to come and at least begin having these talks. So what were some specific influence strategies you think the Pakistanis used, and what do you think was the most effective?
Well, I suspect that the most effective was timing in this case. I mean, I think that Pakistan did have some legitimacy, particularly with Iran, and it's perceived to be, not an actor that is going to be sort of setting something up that is, I think it might be perceived as an honest broker, or as honest broker there is out there from the Iranian perspective. And I think that you can persuade as well that the US that it can fulfill that role. But I think that more critically, when you're engaged in influence and persuasion, sometimes understanding timing is really, really important. When does a particular set of actions and offers really make a difference? And for me, the timing was absolutely critical. It was critical, to give the off ramp that we referred to earlier to Trump, but then it sort of sets it up. And hopefully, once you've sort of set up the start of that process, although round one, did not, last very long, hopefully under the auspices of Pakistan, this can continue, whether, it doesn't have to take place in Islamabad. I mean, a lot of the time it will take place under the auspices of Pakistan it could be in Geneva, it doesn't really matter. But hopefully, this will be a continuation of this.
Right. So the concept of cultural intelligence is often considered very important when it comes to having a successful negotiation. Do you think cultural asymmetry played a big role in making the first round of these negotiations unsuccessful? You already touched upon the fact that there's a lot of difference in between the backgrounds of both negotiating parties, in the sense that Iran and the leadership of Iran has more experience when it comes to having negotiations of this scale, whereas the US sent people who had more of, let's say, a practitioner's approach, where they come from a real estate or a business background. So how much does cultural asymmetry play a role in this?
I think I'd broaden out cultural asymmetry to at least, three or four dimensions, right? One, let's just take the sort of the sort of the cultural dimension, if you like, or let me call it, the geographic and the regional dimension, which is, what is the knowledge of the core US negotiators? What is their deep understanding of the Gulf more generally, and I think that is pretty limited. And I think that people like Steve Witkoff have said in the past that they, well, I don't have a great deal of knowledge about that, and he clearly doesn't have a great deal of knowledge about sort of the nuclear dimension as well. And I think that sort of statements that, well, I've read about it, I've learnt about it. I think that's the transition from sort of to have that depth of knowledge is quite difficult. Now, so I think that is one, and that was sort of certainly lacking in the particular choices that the US made. It's not that there aren't plenty of people in the US with the profound expertise that is required. It's just that they haven't been put at the table. The choices, including again under the auspices of Oman in February, were to have Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff being the two at the table. With very limited support at the table of the experts, and you see that again when you come to the table in Islamabad. If you can put in JD Vance, because quite understandably of the limited trust that Iran would have in the former two, but there isn't the depth of knowledge of the region or of anything else that pertains to a successful conclusion of these negotiations. So while Iran turns up with this very large number of people with expertise, the US didn't have the same structure. So that sort of raises the question of what were the intentions behind this particular set of negotiations. And we then come back, of course, to sort of the positional dimension. I think that sort of cultural dimension, as well as to use that phrase, then, as you rightly say, it's about the pattern of negotiations that you have experience at, and your understanding of the length of time and what different signals and things actually mean. And if you don't understand the diplomatic language of this, then that becomes difficult. Now, just, I guess, add one other dimension which makes the job even harder at times for some of the US negotiators, which is that their attention was being divided between negotiating with Iran while at the same time trying to deal with Ukraine, etc. So if you can't focus in this much deeper way, then it's going to be particularly hard.
So you've written extensively on Brexit as well. That was another negotiation which had a huge impact on domestic politics. And it played a big role at how things progressed at the diplomatic stage as well. If you were to draw a comparison, how differently do you think the Trump administration or President Trump himself is handling this situation compared to how British politicians handled Brexit?
A very nice question, right? I think that that one of the sort of features of the negotiations in Britain was the extent to which the Britain had failed to do sufficient preparation going into the negotiations, and it believed that the hand that it held was much stronger than it actually was, and that it would be able to demand sufficiently more. At least the Brexiteers, believed that, and that there was a constant difficulty of managing two different things, which were the messages that were intended to be sent to the domestic audience, and the messages that were being intended to be sent to the European negotiators. And of course, one of the difficulties is that even if you intend a different message to go to one audience or another, both audiences will often see both aspects of those messages. And so, constantly in the Brexit negotiations, the Europeans were looking at statements that British were making and to the domestic audience and understanding what that meant. Britain, of course, had gone in a position that it believed was much stronger than it was. I think one of the fundamental dimensions was that Britain's position had proved to be much weaker fundamentally, and it was unable to make demands of Europe that many on the Brexiteer side believed that it would be able to achieve. Now, of course, in one sense, one would be mistaken to draw a close analogy with the balance of power. But I think that what is, of course, interesting in this is that I think that from a US perspective, there was this notion going in that this, militarily you'd be able to force a change, and Iran would acquiesce under that, sort of heavy threat. And of course, that hasn't been the case. But something that clearly the Trump administration had not banked on, which was the ability of the Iranians to use the Strait of Hormuz as a bargaining tool, as something that was much easier to leverage than was anticipated, and then puts a more domestic pressure, of course, on the US, as you see the rise in gas prices and so on, which raising inflation, which of course was something that Trump had been concerned about, or had been declaring his victories in lowering gas prices from the Biden administration, and that, so the domestic pressure then on Trump increases in a not insignificant way.
Professor, as you know, in mediation theory, there are three different distinguished profiles of a mediator, be it the facilitator, the formulator, or the manipulator. Could you briefly touch upon these three different roles that a mediator can play? And from the perspective of Pakistan, which one of these three roles do you see Pakistan sort of coming into more than the other?
Your ability to use different approaches as a mediator is critically dependent upon the parties at the table and what stage and willingness they are to allow a mediator to play a role. So this isn't something that a mediator imposes upon the other parties. It's a role that that other parties have to be in a position where they think that there will be significant value in the mediator playing that role. And I think that you can have a mediator that is very, very successful at crafting solutions, because it can often be more effective at gathering information from both sides when it's perceived to be, I can declare information to you because you will treat it, with confidentiality, and you'll be able to gather information from the other side. So you'll be able to perceive solutions that won't be perceived, if the two parties who lack sufficient trust simply engage with one another and try and share information. You can also have the role where you're managing the process very effectively. Now, I think that my instinct, is that the US is not in the point at which it would, go much beyond a mediator, if you like, facilitating the process. I can't quite see the Trump administration sort of saying, okay, we'll have a mediator that is going to try to craft a solution and gather that, sort of a scale of information.
So as we've seen historically, be it the Camp David Accords or any of the mediations that have followed, a lot of the mediations involve a painstakingly long and drawn out process and a sequence that has to be followed in a particular way before a certain agreement is reached. So if you were to advise the Pakistani mediation team, because Pakistan still seems very involved in the mediation process, what steps should Pakistan take next, since the trust between the US and Iran still stands at absolutely zero?
Absolutely, yes, and that lack of trust is, going to be something that is incredibly difficult to rebuild. And unfortunately, the steps that are appropriate in order to try to build that, I think, are becoming more harder. A lot of trust can be built in people. It can be built in institutions, and what we've seen is over the last couple of years is an undermining of institutions, globally, and we can see that in a whole series of different spheres. So the confidence that you can have in those institutions, I think, has been weakened. And I think that on a personal level, they're clearly low as well. We've already discussed the February negotiations, where even the next round of the negotiations had been scheduled for the beginning of March, and yet then the attacks by Israel and the US took place. So when you interrupt a set of negotiations, which again, according to accounts, have been making progress, and if you look at sort of the information that has sort of been indicated via people like, or drawing on insights from people like Jonathan Powell, who was from an incredibly experienced British negotiator, and you mentioned the Good Friday negotiations, and he was somebody who was absolutely critical in those negotiations. By all accounts, he found some of the proposals that Iran was putting extremely interesting. In other words, they formed the basis of which you might be able to move forward in a meaningful way, and yet that was either not understood, probably not understood by the US, by Wickoff and Kushner, and hence what we saw was the next stage of this. So the difficulty that Pakistan faces, to try to come back to your more specific question, is this conflict between the different dimensions that you've raised, which is you've got those three sort of Oslo Accords, Camp David, Good Friday. These things took place over extended periods of time. The Good Friday period, this is years, leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, and then after the Good Friday Agreement as well. And so time is the critical challenge. How can Pakistan establish if you like, a sufficient pause that gives a more extended period of time for both parts, for the temperature to settle? Can you have a sufficient pause and ceasefire where you can then carry on these conversations without these extraordinarily short time periods? And if Pakistan can find I guess if you come back to your mediation question, if you can find a creative solution to enable the parties to do that, then that would be something that would be phenomenally valuable.
So, Professor, in previous conversations we've had with experts regarding this topic, back channels were often identified as being crucial in making negotiations successful. To what extent do you think that this is true? And from Oxford's research, how important do you think back channels are? And at what stage can they have a negative impact, or at what stage can they actually drive positive impact on the negotiation landscape?
Back channels, there's no doubt about them, can be phenomenally important. Most of the negotiations that you referred to, Good Friday, et cetera, all of those entail long extended periods of back channel communication, prior to the main parts of the negotiations. And often when it's incredibly difficult for either party to admit or to, make public the fact that they are having exchanges, there are important back channel discussions going on. And those can take place in different ways. So I think that they're incredibly important, and we should always give the space to those, and if you like, you sort of encourage the role that they can play, because they can they facilitate the exchange of information over a period of time, and the building up of this deeper understanding that both sides actually have. At the same time, back channel negotiations will usually take place, sort of separately to, but often before we've got to, these more formal negotiations taking place. So, I expect there may still be some back channel negotiations going on, although I suspect that there are different ways of doing it. You can either have the direct back channel negotiations, or you can have sort of sometimes as an alternative, it's not exclusive, but you can have the role of, for example, Pakistan trying to do something that's very, very similar in gathering the information. And so I think that it is as likely that latter one will be the core mechanism at the moment.
Something we haven't touched upon so far in this conversation, and even with previous guests, is the role of spoilers. Actors who have an incentive in letting these talks fail, or the negotiations to not lead anywhere. In this instance, who do you identify as being those spoilers? And as mediators, what role do you think Pakistan can play in sort of neutralizing these spoilers?
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about spoilers is groups that have a different set of objectives, or a belief that a different path will lead to the achievement of the objectives, even if your underlying objectives are not, sort of fundamentally dissimilar. Without sort of, profound, deep, sort of insight, sort of inside knowledge or anything like that, it certainly appears that Israel has a different set of objectives, and that it has been influential in, pushing the US towards this, the extent of the conflict, and pushing the US to war. And again, from what one can understand, it sees there being an advantage of taking a weakened position in Lebanon and continuing to attack Iran to achieve that maximalist position. So I think that in one sense the greatest challenge might well lie with the Israeli position, given that they do have quite a lot of influence within the US administration. So I think that might well be sort of the most important one to focus on.
So we've spoken about a lot of previous agreements and previous mediations that have happened between these two parties. And the most recent one was the joint action plan that you referred to at the start of this conversation that took place in 2015. But what was different about those mediations was that there were a lot of different parties involved. It was usually done along with multilateral organizations, where the EU always also played a very large, a significant role in the 2015 action plan as well. Over here, the approach seems to be completely different now, where Pakistan seems to be a party that's trusted by both the US and Iran, and the approach towards mediation seems to have gone from a focus on multilateralism to more unilateralism. Do you think this has more to do with the way the Trump administration handles things, since they are less, they're more critical of multilateral organizations? Or do you think this can be counted more of a success of Pakistan winning the trust of both parties?
I think that the move away from multilateralism is very much a feature of the Trump administration, and of Donald Trump himself. He doesn't want to engage others, doesn't feel the need to engage other parties. So there isn't information shared with other parties. And again, if the reports include that back, if you go back to the February negotiations, that the view, at least from the British involvement in those negotiations, which wasn't involvement in the negotiations, although it was that Jonathan Powell was there while not negotiating, but believed that there was a path forward, and therefore the idea that we're in a position that actually moving towards war was appropriate, was clearly, the British position is that was not. And hence you then had a further move away from multilateralism, because, other countries from the European Union to specific countries, whether it's sort of Spain not allowing flying rights and so on and so forth, those are all a move away from multilateralism, because there's not an acceptance that this was a path that was appropriate to take. And there's then a further undermining of the international institutions that we've discussed before. So I think that we've moved quite a long way away from that multilateral approach, and I think that is itself problematic, and it's problematic because it's going to make it harder to sustain a particular agreement that you might be seeking. I think there's a huge advantage where you've got a country involved and you're trying to reach a really complex agreement, that you can bring in these different actors, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the IAEA, or whoever it happens to be. Bringing in those actors, I think, is important. Now, in the absence of those, a multilateral approach, then I think that the role that Pakistan has played has been, even more important, if you like. There aren't other actors who are able to fill that gap, and hence, that we should all be incredibly thankful for that role of Pakistan.
What do you think is Britain's role in all of this, and how significant is that role? I mean, historically, not too long ago, members of the House of Lords were key players in negotiating terms with Iran. But now Britain seems to have become rather insignificant when it comes to these mediation efforts, where the British Prime Minister, while these major talks were happening in Islamabad and all key players were there, had a visit in the UAE. So how does Britain see this, and how significant is its role in all of this?
Yeah, I suspect it's not. I suspect that it's not very significant, and I don't think that it would have the same credibility or the same trust that a country like Pakistan would have. I mean, you've got to be perceived by both parties as to be a really honest broker, if you like, within this context. And I think it's quite difficult to perceive the Britain as being as sort of an entirely neutral party within this. Now, that you're right that in the previous negotiations going up to the 2015 agreement, you had particular people, Cathy Ashton, for example, playing a really fundamentally key role. But that was, of course, not as a a mediator or an honest broker. It was part of the negotiating team, and one of the things that was then very successful. So that's on an individual level, representing the European Union in the negotiations and building, for example, trust with the individual negotiators, and building trust that the European Union itself was sort of an institution that was an honest part actor. Yes, it came from a particular side, right? It was party to the negotiations rather than a mediator. But in that you can still be a trusted actor. And I think that Britain doesn't have a role because it's not it's not going to play a role alongside the US as a negotiator on the US side, and it doesn't have that role as being an independent actor either. So I wouldn't see it playing a role in that. There may be other European countries who have historically done so that you could imagine doing it. But actually, if Pakistan is able to do that, then there's clearly no need for a different party to play that role.
Professor Darbishire, you've taught negotiation to hundreds of organizations, be it corporate or multilateral organizations. What can Pakistan's mediation team learn from some of the principles of corporate or multilateral negotiations and mediations?
The most important ones are patience and persistence. You don't give up. You keep working over. Times will be difficult. There will be lots of barriers and blocks in the road. Don't expect solutions to come quickly. They won't. You keep working hard. You work hard to keep the trust of both sides. As from Pakistan's perspective, you try to see if you can facilitate some increased trust between the two. But at least if Pakistan can have be a trusted party. But persistence and patience are really, really important in negotiations. These are complex interactions to have. And then, of course, the others, which are core principles of negotiations, that you need to have exchange information, but you need to think creatively, and creative solutions that recognize the interests of both sides and think, how is it that we're able to achieve those? And some of those interests, as we talked about before, might be material, they might be economic, they might be about what a pause is with respect to, a pause in the enrichment of uranium. But they might also be making sure that you save face of both sides. So there are multiple dimensions upon which you can, sort of play a role. So it's gathering information, it's being creative, it's putting forward, seeing if you can develop different packages that meet the deep and fundamental interests, but then support those in other ways. How can you trade off, for example, a pause in nuclear enrichment inspection with the removal of sanctions and access to the financial system? There are different paths that I think appear to have been there in the past. I think some demands, it's trying to help both sides understand that some demands, are never going to be accepted without there being a much higher level of trust than there is. So, some of the demands that have been put forward by, the US, by all accounts, they can't be accepted by, or won't be accepted, I should say, by Iran, without there being a really, really deep level of trust, which is very unlikely to come. So you then have to think about other solutions to those particular issues.
Professor Darbishire, I'd like to end today's conversation with a question pertaining to Pakistan's international image. I mean, obviously, we are a country that has suffered a lot when it comes to international image, how we are perceived almost as a pariah state in a lot of Western capitals until recently, until the last couple of years perhaps, where we have been viewed with a lens of mistrust. But when so many countries and international players are putting this trust in Pakistan and playing such a key role when it comes to mediating what could potentially be World War III. How can Pakistan make this into a more long-lasting diplomatic impact on its credibility? How can we as a nation institutionalize this credibility so we are perceived this way in the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the start there's a really good starting point here, which is that Pakistan has done an enormous service in giving an off ramp to the US and structuring this framework, and we hopefully that will then sort of continue. And I think that if Pakistan can I don't think I've got any sort of deep or profound advice, but if it can continue to be perceived or act as an honest broker in these ways, to play that sort of to fulfill the role that it's currently playing, then I think that it's got the opportunity to move along the path that you said. I mean, one thing that we talked a lot about trust is that trust comes builds up sort of incrementally over time. So there's no real shortcut to trying to achieve that. But so I think that again, it's the same point about patience and persistence. Take the opportunity now. This has been a first step along the path. Continue to then build upon that reputation. Continue to act as an honest broker. The challenge is the institutional tensions that also exist within Pakistan, and how can you actually make sure that those don't derail the progress that you referred to earlier. But these things don't come quickly. But if you have confidence that over a medium period of time they can be achieved, then you can move towards exactly the status that you referred to earlier.
Professor Darbishire, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.